Good afternoon, and welcome to the installation of Dr. Joshua Dienstag to the Shapiro Family Endowed Chair in Modern Political Theory. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences here at UCLA. It is my pleasure to thank Ralph and Shirley Shapiro, both of whom are Bruins, for the establishment of this endowed chair. Ralph, who earned his bachelor's degree in business administration, as well as his law degree, and Shirley, who earned her bachelor's degree in education, are dedicated supporters and beloved members of our UCLA community. Ralph and Shirley's incredible generosity has been transformational for many areas across campus. They have established several endowed chairs at UCLA, which are instrumental in our efforts to retain and recruit top faculty at the leading public university in the nation. We are truly grateful for their gift in support of the Department of Political Science. My congratulations to Joshua Dienstag on becoming the inaugural holder of the Shapiro Family Endowed Chair in Modern Political Theory. Joshua is a distinguished scholar and author in political theory and is most deserving of this tremendous honor. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Che, Chair and Professor of Political Science.
Thank you so much, Dean Hunt, for your thoughtful remarks. I'm Michael Che. I'm currently serving as chair of the Political Science Department here at UCLA. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to the department's celebration of Professor Joshua Fowen Dienstag's appointment as the inaugural holder of the Shapiro Family Endowed Chair in Modern Political Theory. I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Ralph and Shirley Shapiro for this tremendous gift to support the UCLA Department of Political Science. Because of their incredible generosity, we have the honor of celebrating our second endowed chair in the history of the department. Endowed chairs make it possible for us to support the research and teaching of the leading scholars of today and future generations. This endowed chair will have a lasting impact on the department's ability to attract and retain world-class faculty in political theory. Now, on behalf of the department, it is my pleasure to congratulate Professor Joshua Fowen Dienstag on receiving this great honor. Professor Dienstag is a distinguished professor in political science and law, and we are thrilled to hear him speak today on the topic of political theory and the puzzle of representation. Originally from New York City, Professor Dienstag joined the UCLA Department of Political Science in 2005. He received his doctorate from Princeton University in 1993 and taught at the University of Virginia from 1992 to 2005. His books include Dancing in Chains, Narrative and Memory in Political Theory in 1997, Pessimism, Philosophy, Ethics, Spirit from 2006, Cinema, Democracy and Perfectionism, Joshua Fowen Dienstag in Dialogue from 2016, and most recently, Cinema Pessimism, A Political Theory of Representation and Reciprocity from 2020. In this most recent book, Cinema Pessimism, Professor Dienstag includes a chapter on the Up series of documentaries by Michael Laptedt, who interviews a group of people every 7 years from age 7 to age 63. Even though the subjects of this documentary series are perhaps the most comprehensively and fully captured in all of film history, they all feel constrained and uneasy about the documentary series and feel that it somehow captures people without full autonomy, people other than themselves, which perhaps mirrors our current social condition in which we can all communicate more easily than at any time in history, but can still feel profoundly disconnected. Professor Dienstag links this frustration with filmic representation to frustrations with political representation and writes, quote, "The freedom of an individual or of a people is an inevitable conflict with any efforts at representation that can be made on their behalf," unquote. Professor Dienstag's articles have appeared in journals including the American Political Science Review, Polity, Political Theory, where he's now serving as co-editor along with our colleague Davide Panagia and Elizabeth Ellis at the University of Otago, the Journal of Politics, Theory and Event, History and Memory, and New Literary History. He has held fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. So now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Dienstag as the inaugural Shapiro Family Endowed Chair in Modern Political Theory, speaking on political theory and the puzzle of representation. Thank you, Joshua.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Dean Hunt, for those generous words of introduction. Well, first, I'd like to also thank Ralph and Shirley Shapiro for their generosity and their support of my field, of the Political Science Department and the university as a whole. This chair is an incredible gift for our department that will benefit not just the chair holder, but Also, and especially our graduate students and other faculty, and really the whole community of the department. The Shapiros, their devotion to UCLA is legendary, and I'm only the latest in a long line of faculty and students who've benefited from it. It's an enormous honor to be the inaugural holder of the Shapiro Family Chair in Modern Political Theory, and I'll do my best to set a halfway decent example for those who follow. Well, as I was going through my office recently and looking at a bunch of old manuscripts from the days of paper, I was reminded just how many people have helped me along the path that brought me to this point today. Literally dozens of people who I have handwritten records of who helped my work or supported it by editing or commenting or something like that. And beyond those bits of assistance that I have a physical record of, there are dozens more people, teachers, colleagues, students, and family who've helped me to develop as a scholar or as a writer or as a person. Most of all, my parents, my wife Jennifer, and my children Sophia and Isaac, and my political theory colleagues here at UCLA. So to all of you, some of you are here today, some aren't. I just want to say a profound thank you. No one really has a scholarly career all by themselves. I didn't always understand that maybe when I was younger, but I do today, and I'm trying to pay it forward to the next generation of students and scholars. Okay. Well, sometimes it can be hard to understand the place of political theory within the larger field of political science. Political theory seems to deal with possible worlds, with utopias or ideal speech situations where everyone is perfectly rational, while political science deals with power, votes, and money, the facts and figures of real political life, which is very far, as we know, from an ideal or utopian situation. Economics, after all, doesn't have a subfield which imagines everyone to be rich, and anthropology doesn't have a subfield that imagines everyone to be happy. But political theory is not part of political science by mistake. It's always been an element of the field since what we now call political science emerged in German universities in the 19th century under the title of Staatswissenschaft, or state science. Most of the early American political scientists, like Francis Lieber, usually called the first American political scientist, he had a German PhD, and most of the other early American political scientists had German PhDs or were trained by people who did. And all these people had a very specific idea of what states were and how they could best be studied. They were certainly trying to develop a science of the state, but science to them didn't mean something that was necessarily mathematical or founded in measurement. At the same time as they were developing Staatswissenschaft, their colleagues in other parts of the university were trying to develop science of law and a science of history. And for all these social scientists, science just meant a disciplined and dispassionate study of social regularities that took its shape from the kind of object that it was studying. Now, for these scholars, the state of state science wasn't just any kind of object. States aren't just buildings or armies or voters or politicians. States may include all these things, but to these early social scientists, states are also, and primarily, the ideas that hold all these things together into a cohesive whole. In the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau had said that every state only existed when there was a general will among its people that it should exist. And Baron Montesquieu had maintained that every state had a particular kind of spirit or principle that held it together and distinguished it from every other. Now, the German state scientists of the mid-19th century weren't necessarily that impressed with Rousseau or Montesquieu, but they were deeply taken with Kant and Hegel, who were both very clear that the conclusions of philosophy weren't distinct from those of science, but in fact fundamentally similar. Kant and Hegel had taken these earlier ideas about states and expressed them in a more formal way. States for them were ultimately structured and held together by laws, and laws, whatever else they were structured by some ideas of right and justice. Law isn't just an arbitrary collection of rules and prohibitions. It makes sense as a system by being related to what's right, good, or virtuous. Different states have different laws, not just because of historical happenstance, but because these laws are ultimately related to different ideas or different principles, what Rousseau and Montesquieu would have called different wills or different spirits. So in this perspective, any state science had to start from the ideas or principles at the core of any state and move outward from there to its other institutions. So political theory The political theory that's part of political science studies ideas of right and wrong because states are built around these ideas and are animated by them. States have budgets and parties and elections and wars, but states themselves are, in the end, social systems that require ideas as their source of energy in order to come to life. And so for Staatswissenschaft, what we now distinguish as normative and empirical inquiry were not really two distinct kinds of investigation. They were brought together in the study of the state because the state itself was a social structure composed of ideas. And so it was properly the subject simultaneously of normative and empirical evaluation. In order to understand what a state is empirically, they thought you had to understand the ideas that were at its core. So without political theory on this way of thinking about the field, there just could be no science of the state. So today, political scientists no longer limit themselves to the study of states. We study politics more broadly, both that which takes place in and around the state, as well as that which takes place outside of it in households and in the streets, as well as at the border and internationally. And at the same time, political theorists are no longer as confident as our Enlightenment predecessors were that we can be certain which are the better ideas. The ideal state of Kant and Hegel, from our perspective, is structured around ideas that at their core are hierarchical, anti-democratic, racist, sexist. But the general perspective that politics is fundamentally animated by ideas and not only by power and interest. The thought that ideas in fact define what identity, power, and interest are rather than the other way around. That perspective still makes for a powerful lens through which to view politics. And that's why political theory, I believe, still has a large contribution to make to the study of politics. To illustrate what I mean by all that, I want to talk today about what I called in the title, the puzzle of representation. And this does have to do with my most recent book that Michael mentioned briefly in his introduction, Cinema Pessimism. It's not an exaggeration today to say that many of the Western democracies are facing a crisis of representation. By that, I mean that democratic populations or a big subsection of those populations are dissatisfied, not just with their particular representatives, but with their systems of representation as a whole. In the US, it's Tea Party, January 6th, maybe the whole Republican Party. In France, it's the Yellow Vest movement. In Great Britain, it's Brexit. In Italy, it's the Five Stars. And in India, it's the Hindutva movement. All of these populist movements have threatened to overturn party systems that have lasted for decades or in some cases centuries. And in the last 10 years, political scientists have been preoccupied with trying to understand why these movements have appeared and what forces drive them. A lot has been uncovered, but I'd like to suggest today that there is at least a part of the explanation that requires the perspective of political theory to be properly articulated. It's a puzzle in the first place that citizens in democratic countries aren't more satisfied by the representation they have today. If we ask the question, what makes representation better, then we would have to say that the last 2 centuries have seen extraordinary advances in technologies that seem useful for political representation. Advances in telecommunications mean that the functional distance between elected representatives and constituents, once understood to be large, is now tiny. Representatives no longer ride off to a distant capital where you don't hear from them for 6 months or a year, as they did when the US Constitution was written. Now, citizens can speak to or shout at their representatives on email, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, while representatives constantly poll, email, text, and Instagram their constituents to keep their fingers on the pulse of the public mood. The sheer quantity of information that travels back and forth between representatives and constituents has probably increased 100-fold in the last few decades. And yet for all of that, majorities or substantial minorities in many democratic countries are more dissatisfied with their representatives and seemingly with representative government than ever before. There's a kind of irony here that we shouldn't pass by. The closer our representatives strive to be to us, the farther away it feels like they are. Many political scientists have asked the question, why don't voters support those parties which advance their material interests? And a common answer that's often given is that they have identities that override or redescribe those interests. But if we ask the question, why don't citizens support the very representatives they voted for, representatives who are better informed, better connected to them, and more service-oriented than ever before, then we have a different kind of puzzle and, in a way, a stranger one. By many measures, our electoral systems are more transparent and fairer than they were 25 or 50 years ago, and yet the respect and satisfaction that citizens have for these systems seems to have declined, not just in the US, but in many democratic countries all across the world. My suggestion is that we need a better understanding of the concept of representation and of our ideas about the human person that is the object of political representation to begin to solve this puzzle. And here we could use some help from political theory. Human beings are difficult to represent, a political theorist might say, and their fair representation is difficult to perceive and accept. They're not like other objects of representation. They're not landscapes or buildings or still lives or even plants or animals. Humans are hard to represent because they have, as the political theorist Hannah Arendt argued, a potential for freedom that all these other beings lack. And this potential means, first, that there is an interiority to human subjectivity that's not easily captured by representation. And second, that human beings situated in time express their freedom through constant changes, which frustrate attempts to capture their meaning in representative acts or representative persons. For these reasons, there's therefore something of an inherent tension between freedom and representation that both our theories and our institutions need to attend to more than they do today. So political representation, I would argue, because of these issues, is always in a sense set up to fail in its primary task. I think most of you know that I wrote a book on pessimism, now several books on pessimism, and so that's the pessimistic part of this talk. The representation of humans is always going to fail. But importantly, not all these failures are equal. Some are much better than others. Even the best representations, though, have to deal with these tensions at the heart of what we could call, if we still follow Hannah Arendt, the representative condition. But the better representations are those that take these tensions into account. Political science sometimes takes voters to be a bundle of interests or preferences or identity traits that can be measured and known. But human beings are volatile and don't appear or present themselves all at once. So we can't really ask them to reappear or be represented all at once either. A human being is something that makes itself available for presenting and representing only over time. So good representation has to answer to the whole person, but the whole person is never fixed, never there all at one time. And that's the extraordinary challenge that representing a free people poses, a challenge that political theory can help us to see more clearly. Now, translating this insight into politics and political institutions isn't easy, but it's far from impossible. Some of the institutions of federalism that we already have, for example, though originally conceived and justified in terms of balance of power and division of authority, can also be justified by how they create forms of representation that multiply perspectives and extend over time. Starting from this point, we can conceive of other electoral mechanisms that would further the goal of achieving, insofar as it's possible, the best representation in political institutions of free individuals that are emergent in time. And as I get to the end of my talk, I'll mention some of them. But before we get there, I want to explore a little more fully the puzzle of representation itself. And to do that, I'll take a moment to talk about some of my recent work on documentary film. In the last 20 years or so, political theorists have increasingly looked to film not to replace the traditional texts of political theory, which we still teach, but to supplement them. And that's actually one of the strengths of our program here at UCLA. I'm not the only political theorist here to do it. And it's especially on these questions of representation and personhood that I think film, and especially documentary film, has something to tell us that can't always or can't easily be found in the traditional texts of political theory. That's what I was trying to bring out in Cinema Pessimism, which came out just before the pandemic and at the end of 2019. Film, after all, is also a representational medium which depicts people across time. And in that documentary series, known as the Up series that Michael mentioned, well, I think in that series, you can see a great deal of light thrown onto the question of representation. You might have seen one of these films. They're all kind of similar in format. The first film was made in 1964. It's called 7 Up, first made for a British news program, and then they've made them every 7 years since then. And the most recent, 63 Up, I think was the last film I saw before the movie theaters were shut down in December 2019. And it may be the last one since the director, Michael Apted, recently died. Anyway, the films just follow a group of 14 English people who were first filmed at age 7, and then they're interviewed every 7 years. Now, what's remarkable in this series is the way its evolution parallels that of our democratic institutions and the popular frustration with those institutions. The subjects of the film have over time, in effect, seized control over their own representation, and yet surprisingly, this hasn't really made them any happier with the results. Just like democratic citizens today, they complain about their representation more and more, even as they exert more control over it than ever before. So in a way, the films are like a little microcosm of the populist phenomenon. Originally, the films were about class and destiny, with the rich children and the poor children being contrasted. But over time, the films came to depict their subjects as individuals. As the children grew up, the director couldn't command their participation anymore or order them around. He had to bargain with them. And so he started paying them, but he also had to just bargain with them about the material that he used. So you can see this change in the structure of the films themselves. In the early films, it's just the rich kids versus the poor kids. First, you see the rich kids talk about something like family or religious life, and then you see the poor kids talk about it, and it goes back and forth, rich, poor, rich, poor. But by 28 Up, the fourth film, the film is just divided into 14 equal segments where each child gets their own spotlight, as it were, and that's how it's been ever since. So what's happened here very roughly in the series is a kind of loose analog to a democratic revolution or the technological revolution that's changed our politics. The former subjects of the documentary have wound up not just participating in, but genuinely controlling the circumstances of their own representation. And because of the iterated nature of the project and their capacity to withhold consent, which some of the subjects have definitely exercised, the subjects have developed an unusual power to resist the filmmakers. So the later Up films are, by democratic standards, much more representative than the earlier ones. The subjects control the setting of their speech and choose how to present themselves. And yet, despite all this, and here's the same irony, the subjects of the film aren't any more satisfied by their victory over the director who represented them poorly than they were at the start. And this dissatisfaction comes out in different ways. Sometimes they still don't participate, sometimes they complain, sometimes they refuse to watch. And sometimes they just spend the whole film complaining about how bad the films are. But taken together, their complaints and their general uneasiness with the project, I think, signal a kind of dissatisfaction with representation that is, to put it very roughly, not a complaint about the truthfulness of their representation, but stems from that primary conflict between freedom and representation itself. So let me explain what I mean by that. The third film in the series, 21 Up, opens with a strange scene that's not repeated any other time. The subjects are all brought back together in London, and they're shown the first two films, which, since this was still the age of film, there wasn't any video. They'd never seen them except for the premiere. So they see themselves in their earlier incarnation for the first time, and the film shows them watching themselves. And some of them laugh, some look embarrassed, some look bored. But the point of the scene is their own reflection on themselves over time. The audience gets not just an individual represented at a particular point, but several life stages laid out in sequence, legible in a way that individuals are usually only legible to themselves via memory. So all the later films basically reproduce this experience for their viewers by employing a kind of sedimentary approach where each subject is introduced and displayed in a stage-by-stage way. And in the later films, 75% of what's shown is derived from the earlier ones. And the films naturally become longer as the layers pile up, like a geology project. The sedimented sequential depiction of individuals is now the main point of the films. if you watch a time-lapse film of a flower or of the sun, the point of a time-lapse film is to make visible movement that's normally imperceptible, like the growth of flowers or the movement of the sun. And in the same way, the up films now make it possible to see, in a sense, the growth and development of individuals across decades. There's no other film like it. There's no other form of representation like it. But the subjects themselves don't readily recognize themselves in what they see, nor do they necessarily perceive the continuity that the viewer sees. So when they look at the old films, they'll complain and say it's difficult to believe that it's really us. It's like it's someone else. So why does this keep happening? In fact, we can all experience this with our own old photos or home movies. The time-bound development of individuality that we experience internally, subjectively, is confronted with images fixed in time, and this can produce a kind of uncanny feeling of disconnection, even when the older images are perfectly, absolutely unaltered and true. Any person looking back over their own life or all their actions will find some of these to be so alien to their contemporary self-understanding that they appear to belong to another person entirely. Putting it another way, we can say that even when old images are objectively true, they can't really account for the subjective experience to which they correspond. Films, like all representations, depict what we say and do rather than what we think and feel, how we experience the world from the inside. But however strange they seem to the subjects, the up films actually do give us a view of these people that's far richer than we could have by seeing and talking to them, even in person at any one point in time. The unpredictable and individual character of these citizens isn't really depicted in what they say, but in the accumulation of all the different images, in the totality of all the films, not from any one moment in any of them. And it's the time-lapse quality of these films that allows it to emerge so vividly. The films represent something real then that nonetheless has a hard time presenting itself directly. So without denying the frustrations, the legitimate frustrations of the subject, we can say that here we have a kind of representation that reveals something that's otherwise hard to see. It shows us more of these citizens than they can show of themselves. So with all that in mind, I'll turn back to what it means for representation to fail a little better in the political sphere. Representing free citizens is difficult because of the inherently protean character of individual life, but the films at least offer us a vision of what a better kind of political representation might entail, a presentation of citizens as emergent in time, and thus as more than what they say and do at any one moment. If we're really going to defend any kind of elected representation in an age of radically democratizing technology, this at least gives us one possible path for doing it. Representation, I said before, should answer to the whole person, but the problem is that the whole person is never fixed. So ideally, what we want is for each moment to be available to speak to us as an equal to all the others, but yet as related to all the others, as the different time slices in an up film are interconnected into a narrative. So how can we translate that into democratic institutions? Well, we can start by imagining our political representatives and the system of representation as a whole as having the responsibility of making each part and each time of a community visible to all the others so that each can get a better sense of the whole, and not just the current whole, but the whole as a collection of beings that evolve over time. In some ways, some elements of the US federal system actually do this in a very crude way. We don't, for example, elect our US senators all at once. And from this time-sensitive perspective, it's a virtue of the process when elections are staggered in time. Since human beings present themselves across time, over time, they should be represented over time as well. So we can imagine extending this principle further than we have it institutionalized today, like, for example, having every House district also, like the Senate, elect a series of representatives on a rotation so that each had a longer term of office without reducing the frequency of elections in each constituency. That way, you always have more than one time point simultaneously represented in the legislature. But if we set the goal of representing the time-bound citizen, it's possible to think of other electoral innovations. Electoral districts now normally divide a country space geographically, but we can also think as well of districting across time. That we could, for example, hold portions of any elected body for representatives of different ages, or alternatively to partition the electorate itself by age and have each age segment vote for the representative of its choice. And we can imagine a hybrid system like the German Bundestag, which the German Bundestag has both geographic partitions, but also party list representation, proportional representation. So we could imagine a system that supplemented geographic districts with proportional representation by age as well as by party. Now, systems like this may seem like poor substitutes for the narrative complexity of individuals and communities, and they probably are. But geographic districts are already terrible substitutes for capturing the diversity of attitudes at any one time. So we wouldn't be making things any worse anyway if we tried this experiment. In any case, the point I want to make today really is not so much to recommend one specific structure, but to recognize how the challenges to contemporary representative institutions look different when viewed from this perspective on what human beings are, what their freedom actually consists in, and what the act of representation actually is. Even when our representatives are faithful, honest, and transparent, which we know is not all the time, but even when those conditions exist, in our current system, we can see that they nonetheless provoke an antagonism in their constituents that arises from this basic conflict between freedom and representation. But when we change our idea of representation, our principle of how it's supposed to work, we can start to imagine a different kind of electoral system, one that might fail a little less and so might meet with a little more in the way of public approval. The general challenge is the fact that a system of elections creates a series of snapshots, whereas the human lives that we aim to represent in electoral system, the human lives to be represented take a time-bound narrative form. And that's why we appreciate representatives who can tell a coherent story about the people they represent, one that sounds to them like an authentic account of who they are, even if the words are new to them. And a film, after all, is nothing but a series of individual pictures strung together. And so that at least offers us some hope, if no guarantee, that snapshots can be made to cohere into a narrative. To apply this lesson in a political arena, we might say that the mere report of citizen interests and preferences is no longer something at which our elected representatives particularly excel. We have polling for that. And there are many electronic means, even in a large state, for ascertaining very quickly what it is that the people say they want at a given moment. But representing freedom and a free people is something more complicated than that. And it's more than a simple reflection of citizen preferences at any one time. Representing free citizens is difficult because of the inherently protean character of individual life, but it's also an inherently worthwhile and democratic task. So the better representation brings a community's past and present and future together and creates the potential for all individuals to increase their self-knowledge of this continuity in the process. One of my favorite political theorists, Hans-Georg Gadamer, said this about the good of representation. The world that appears in the play of presentation doesn't stand like a copy next to the real world, but is that world in the heightened truth of its being. More broadly, I don't believe we can understand the problems of this political moment without understanding the ideas that stand at the heart of our institutions and what alternative ideas are available to us in our project of making those institutions better. Our constitutional framework was created with certain ideas of personhood, freedom, and representation in mind. But if those ideas don't answer or no longer answer to the truth of our experience, that's a problem that can't be wished away or solved by better technology or by putting different people in office. It's a problem of political theory and political practice at the same time, because theory and practice can't be separated and always have to be studied together, as the original political scientists, I think, understood. Thank you, and thanks again to the Shapiro family for making this chair possible.
Well, thank you so much, Joshua. I mean, normally if we had this in person, we'd have a question and answer period, but I know that Joshua's remarks and his talk had a lot of interesting things to say, and I'd just encourage you to have, if you have any questions, please reach out to us, and we'll continue the conversation. And again, we'd really appreciate everyone coming, and really very much appreciate Joshua's lecture today, and also, of course, the great generosity of the Shapiro family. So thank you very much, and we'll see you. Everyone have a good summer. We'll see you perhaps at our department's events in the fall. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.